Dawn over the Philippine Sea does not arrive as color or calm. It arrives as interruption. As the first light spreads across the water, the horizon fails to behave as it should. Where empty sea is expected, shapes intrude long, flat silhouettes aligned with mechanical precision. Steel decks stretch outward, one after another, extending beyond what distance and habit suggest is possible. The ocean appears compressed, as if space itself has been miscalculated. On Japanese picket ships, lookouts raise binoculars and begin to count. The process quickly falters. One carrier resolves clearly, then another, then more beyond it. Numbers accumulate too quickly to trust. Counting restarts. Angles change. The result remains the same. No engagement in the Pacific has ever presented so many fleet carriers at once, operating together, visible in daylight, unconcerned with concealment. Doctrine offers no guidance for what to do when precedent runs out. As the sun climbs, the decks animate. Aircraft are brought forward in deliberate waves, engines warming in unison. The sound carries across the water a low, sustained thunder without urgency. Deck crews move with practiced economy, their motions synchronized across ships separated by miles, yet behaving as one. From above, the formation resembles a living system, not an armada of metal and fuel bound together by routine rather than command. Below decks, radar screens confirm what the eyes resist. Contacts populate the scopes in structured depth, layered and stable. This is not a fleeting concentration of force. It is capacity, maintained, and organized across hundreds of miles. What has arrived is not a raid, not even a battle fleet in the traditional sense, but the visible edge of an industrial process now operating at sea. On command bridges, realization settles quickly. No alarms mark the moment, no signal flags change. Yet within seconds, it becomes clear that the balance governing the Pacific has shifted. The assumptions that shaped planning, training, and expectation no longer apply. The scale alone rewrites calculation. Earlier, judgments surface without comfort. The dismissals, the private laughter at American inefficiency, at the belief that such numbers could never be sustained. Those echoes fade now, replaced by the measurable reality filling the horizon. The war reaches a threshold in this moment. Disbelief gives way to accounting. And as the carriers hold formation without haste, one question lingers unanswered. How long had this force been building, unseen, while attention was fixed elsewhere? 17 fleet carriers do not maneuver like 17 ships. They behave as a single system, dispersed yet unified, coordinated across distances that once made control impossible. Signals pass without friction. Air patrols overlap without confusion. What appears vast from the surface reveals itself, operationally, as orderly. The scale does not dilute command, it amplifies it. Each flight deck carries more than aircraft. It carries years of labor steel shaped in inland mills, engines assembled far from salt water, rivets driven by hands that will never see the ocean they support. These ships are not symbols improvised for battle. They are the visible output of schedules kept, quotas met, and processes repeated until reliability replaced improvisation. What floats here is industry translated into motion. Japanese officers study the formation and feel doctrine strain under observation. Naval theory had limits, practical ones, assumed ones. There were supposed to be ceilings to coordination, thresholds beyond which complexity defeated control. Yet here, those limits appear absent. The fleet does not sprawl, it holds. The numbers do not fracture effectiveness, they sustain it. This force did not emerge suddenly, despite how it feels. It did not rush forward in desperation or surge unpredictably. It arrived on time. The timing itself is unsettling. Only something built deliberately, over years, could appear with such confidence. Surprise is not its greatest weapon. Predictability is. The carriers project more than immediate power. They suggest continuity. Every calculation now must account not only for what is present, but for what can follow replacement hulls, replacement aircraft, replacement crews. The threat is no longer a single engagement lost or won. It is the knowledge that engagement itself favors one side repeatedly. From the bridge, the sea appears diminished. Water gives way to steel and aviation fuel, to wake lines crisscrossing with mechanical indifference. Space, once a defensive ally, offers no relief. Distance no longer guarantees safety. The ocean has been reorganized. Shock recedes, replaced by something colder. Fear not of destruction, but of reproduction. This force can be rebuilt, expanded, and sustained. And as that realization settles, another question forms: how many more such fleets could exist beyond the horizon, waiting their turn to arrive? Memory intrudes quietly, not as regret, but as recollection. Earlier assessments return, spoken in briefing rooms, written in margins, shared with confidence among professionals who believed they understood the future of naval war. American carrier doctrine had been discussed often and dismissed just as easily. The numbers proposed were judged unrealistic, wasteful, even. No nation, it was believed, would invest so much into platforms thought inherently vulnerable. Carriers, in those earlier conversations, were described as fragile instruments, large, complex, and demanding. Their flight decks were exposed. Their aircraft depended on weather, coordination, and uninterrupted logistics. Compared to the armored certainty of battleships, they seemed indulgent tools for experimentation rather than decision. Wars, doctrine insisted, would still be decided by heavy guns meeting at range, by decisive engagements measured in minutes, not sustained operations measured in months. That belief shaped planning. It shaped shipbuilding priorities, training pipelines, and strategic imagination. Carrier aviation was respected, but contained useful as support, dangerous if overextended. The idea that flight decks could replace gun barrels as the central measure of sea power felt premature, even reckless. Confidence followed naturally from that assumption. Now, observation replaces theory. The doctrine built on limitation collapses not through argument, but through visibility. No exercise can explain away what fills the horizon. No theoretical weakness matters when multiplied beyond interruption. Fragility, repeated often enough, becomes resilience. Complexity, standardized and rehearsed, becomes routine. What was once dismissed as impractical now operates without strain. On Japanese bridges, conversation fades. Orders are issued when required, but reflection dominates the intervals between action. Silence settles not confusion, not panic, but something heavier. A recognition that the framework used to understand this war no longer applies. There is no immediate correction available, no doctrinal adjustment fast enough to restore balance. The laughter of earlier years does not return as embarrassment. It returns as absence. As the space where certainty once stood, the cold open closes not with revelation spoken aloud, but with an unvoiced truth forming across multiple decks at once. This war is no longer being fought on familiar terms, and it has not been for some time. In the years between the world wars, the great navies argue quietly about the future. The debates are technical, restrained, and shaped by memory. The First World War had ended with fleets largely intact, battleships still afloat, and conclusions drawn cautiously. Sea power, it was believed, had proven its fundamentals. The question was not whether battleships still mattered, but how much supporting machinery they required around them. International treaties formalized this restraint. Tonnage limits cap ambition. Ratios replace imagination. Ship designs are negotiated as much in conference rooms as in shipyards. The effect is subtle but enduring. Innovation slows not because ideas vanish, but because excess is discouraged. Risk becomes politically expensive. Conservatism feels responsible. Japan adapts comfortably to this world. Its naval philosophy centers on quality elite crews, long training cycles, and the expectation of a single decisive battle that will determine the fate of a war. Precision is prized over volume. Doctrine favors concentration at the moment of contact rather than endurance across time. It is a philosophy shaped by geography, resources, and confidence in preparation. Across the Pacific, the United States appears less certain. Its attention is divided between oceans, budgets, and domestic priorities. Naval policy advances unevenly, shaped by compromise rather than urgency. Carrier aviation exists, but without consensus. Early experiments feel provisional flight decks adapted from earlier hulls, procedures written and rewritten through trial rather than conviction. Progress is visible, but hesitant. From the outside, this hesitation reads as confusion. American carrier doctrine appears fragmented, lacking clarity of purpose. Exercises reveal promise, but also vulnerability. Accidents occur. Aircraft struggle with reliability. Coordination across multiple carriers seems aspirational rather than practical. To observers trained in decisive battle theory, it looks inefficient. Japanese confidence grows quietly, not through bravado, but through assumption. If the future of naval war demands decisiveness, then excess platforms appear unnecessary. If skill determines outcome, then numbers beyond a certain threshold seem wasteful. The American approach, with its experiments and scale, feels inelegant, too dependent on industry, too reliant on replacement rather than mastery. That judgment hardens over time. It becomes embedded not only in planning, but in expectation. Carrier aviation is acknowledged, but contained within boundaries defined by belief. The idea that one nation might build, sustain, and operate carriers in unprecedented numbers never becomes urgent enough to challenge those boundaries. Underestimation, once repeated often enough, ceases to feel like risk. It becomes doctrine, and with doctrine comes comfort, the dangerous confidence that the future will unfold within familiar limits. What no one fully considers is how quietly those limits are already being prepared for removal, far from the arguments that define this era. Within the United States Navy, certainty does not come easily. Through the interwar years, carriers remain a subject of debate rather than doctrine. Admirals argue over their purpose, whether they exist to scout for battleships, to protect convoys, or to strike independently. No single vision dominates. The carrier is acknowledged as promising, but not yet decisive. Its role unresolved within a fleet still oriented around heavy guns. Beyond the Navy, hesitation deepens. Congress debates costs with caution shaped by memory of the last war and suspicion of the next. Budgets contract, then stagnate. Shipbuilding priorities shift with political winds, and long-term planning becomes vulnerable to delay. To outside observers, this uncertainty appears as strategic drift, an absence of resolve rather than a form of restraint. Yet beneath that surface, preparation continues. American shipyards do not idle, they expand quietly, extending slipways, standardizing tooling, and training a workforce capable of rapid growth if called upon. These are not dramatic gestures. They attract little attention, but they represent readiness of a different kind, the capacity to scale when necessity arrives. Design offices work with similar patience. Hull forms are adjusted incrementally, balancing speed with protection. Elevators are redesigned to move aircraft more efficiently between hangars and decks. Internal layouts evolve to support sustained operations rather than short sorties. Each refinement is modest in isolation, but cumulative in effect. The carrier becomes less experimental, more dependable. Exercises at sea provide hard lessons. Failures are recorded without embarrassment. Accidents become data. Operational weaknesses are neither denied nor publicized. Instead, they are cataloged, studied, and folded back into design and training. Nothing is discarded simply because it did not work the first time. Progress advances not through breakthrough, but through persistence. Abroad, this process remains largely invisible. There are no parades for standardized bulkheads or revised deck handling procedures. No speeches announce improvements in logistics or survivability. What exists is a growing body of experience, quietly shaping a platform meant to endure rather than impress. From this methodical accumulation, belief begins to form. Not the loud confidence of doctrine, but the quieter assurance that systems can be built to improve themselves. It is belief without arrogance, grounded in repetition and patience. And while debate continues openly, something irreversible is taking shape, an industrial answer waiting for the moment when doubt will no longer be an option. Japanese naval intelligence in the interwar years observes American carriers carefully but in isolation. Each hull is tracked as a separate project, evaluated on its own merits, its own vulnerabilities. The possibility that these ships are meant to operate not as exceptions but as a unified mass receives little emphasis. Analysis remains linear in a world that is about to become exponential. American production schedules, when examined, appear implausible. Timelines suggest hulls completed in intervals that seem optimistic, even careless. From a perspective shaped by artisanal shipbuilding and limited industrial margins, such projections feel detached from reality. Warships, it is believed, cannot be rushed without sacrifice. Précision demande time. This belief shapes perception of scale. Industrial output, when viewed from afar, looks inefficient. Too many workers, too many processes, Too much reliance on standardization. Quantity appears to dilute quality. A ship produced quickly is assumed to be inferior. A design repeated too often feels stagnant, unable to adapt to the demands of combat. Japanese doctrine offers reassurance. Training is elite. Pilots are among the best in the world, selected carefully and refined through long preparation. Crews are expected to compensate for material disadvantage through skill and discipline. In this equation, numbers matter only until quality asserts itself. Victory is anticipated not through endurance, but through mastery at the moment of decision. Standardized fleet carriers, therefore, feel inelegant. They lack the refinement of bespoke construction, the prestige of unique design. To produce many similar ships suggests compromise rather than excellence. It signals dependence on volume instead of brilliance. Such an approach invites dismissal rather than alarm. Confidence follows naturally. It does not express itself publicly, but it permeates assumptions. The American carrier program becomes something to be watched, not feared. Its scale is noted, then discounted. The laughter that emerges is not ridicule, but certainty, the quiet amusement of professionals convinced they have measured their opponent correctly. Over time, that certainty hardens. Alternative interpretations fade. Warnings lose urgency. Strategic imagination narrows. What begins as confidence becomes blindness, not sudden, but gradual. And by the time the implications of industrial repetition begin to surface at sea, the space for correction has already disappeared. When war approaches certainty, American shipyards change character. What had once been measured expansions become accelerations. Slipways multiply. Night shifts become routine. The sound of steel on steel carries without pause, day blending into night under arc lights and cranes. This is not improvisation. It is activation, an industrial system moving from readiness into motion. The method itself marks a departure from tradition. Modular construction replaces artisanal warship building. Hull sections are fabricated separately, then joined with speed that would have seemed reckless a decade earlier. Precision is preserved not through slowness, but through repetition. The same measurements, the same tolerances, the same processes are executed again and again until error is designed out of the system. At the center of this effort sits the Essex design. It is not radical in appearance, but deliberate in balance. Protection is sufficient to survive damage, not eliminate it. Air capacity is maximized without sacrificing stability. Speed remains high enough to dictate engagement rather than react to it. Nothing about the design seeks perfection. Everything about it seeks sustainability. Timelines reflect that philosophy. Delays occur, but they are counted in weeks, not years. When problems arise, solutions are standardized rather than bespoke. Changes are folded into the production line without halting it. The goal is not to produce a flawless ship, but a reliable one, and then to produce another just like it. The workforce understands only fragments of the whole. Riveters, welders, electricians, and engineers know their tasks precisely, but rarely the strategic implications of their labor. They do not need to. The system depends not on individual vision, but on collective consistency. Each completed section fits because it was designed to fit every time. In this environment, the carrier ceases to be a singular achievement. Each hull is a template, not a prototype. Lessons learned on one ship are applied immediately to the next. Improvement becomes continuous rather than episodic. Experience is no longer trapped within a single vessel. It is transferred along the line. What emerges is a new form of warfare, almost unnoticed as it takes shape. Heroic narratives give way to schedules. Strategy becomes inseparable from calendars and output charts. Victory begins to favor those who can maintain pressure rather than deliver a single blow. As hulls slide into the water in steady succession, the nature of the conflict changes quietly. Somewhere far from the front lines, amid steel plates and clipped timetables, the war is already being decided long before the enemy can see what is coming. The early battles of the Pacific provide no illusions. Carriers enter combat not as finished answers, but as questions under fire. Bombs penetrate flight decks. Fires spread faster than theory predicted. Aircraft are lost on approach, missed by inches or consumed by flame on landing. The promise of the carrier is proven real, but so are its vulnerabilities, exposed without mercy by combat. From these encounters, damage control doctrine evolves rapidly. What had once been procedures on paper become instincts learned through blood and smoke. Crews discover how quickly steel can fail and how decisively it can be saved. Firefighting techniques are revised. Compartmentalization is emphasized. Redundancy becomes essential rather than optional. Survival is no longer assumed, it is engineered. Air group composition changes as well. Early optimism gives way to necessity. Fighters must do more than escort. Torpedo bombers must adapt or be replaced. The balance between offense and defense shifts with experience, shaped not by theory but by attrition. Aircraft that cannot survive are removed. Those that can are produced in greater numbers. The air wing becomes a living structure, altered continuously by reality. Command structures adjust under similar pressure. Single carrier operations prove insufficient against layered threats. Coordination across multiple decks becomes mandatory. Task groups expand, then reorganize. Responsibility disperses without confusion. Authority becomes procedural rather than personal. The carrier ceases to be an independent weapon and becomes part of a network protected, supplied, and synchronized. Crucially, mistakes are examined without sentiment. Losses are counted, but not romanticized. Reports are blunt. Errors are documented and shared across the fleet. There is no time for denial, no benefit in pride. Every failure becomes instruction. Every survival becomes a data point. From this process emerges a new design philosophy. Survivability is no longer treated as secondary to striking power. It becomes foundational. Ships are expected to absorb damage and remain operational. Crews are trained not to avoid catastrophe, but to contain it. Endurance replaces elegance. The pace of this learning proves decisive. Each engagement sharpens the system. Each battle leaves the fleet stronger than before. Across the ocean, the enemy watches results but misses the process behind them. By the time the pattern becomes visible, the advantage is no longer tactical, it is cumulative, and it is accelerating. By the middle of the war, the Essex carrier can no longer be understood in isolation. It does not sail alone, and it does not fight alone. Around each flight deck forms a layered screen destroyers, tracing tight circles, cruisers holding station beyond them, fighters orbiting overhead. Threats are intercepted not at the moment of impact, but in sequence, at distance, through depth. Defense becomes procedural, not reactive. This layered protection extends beyond weapons. Logistics, ships, oilers, ammunition vessels, repair tenders move with the fleet, erasing limits that once defined naval operations. Fuel is transferred at sea. Aircraft are replenished without retreat. Time away from the front shrinks until it nearly disappears. The carrier is no longer bound to ports or pauses. Its reach becomes continuous. Technology binds this system together. Radar sees before eyes can. Radios carry decisions faster than flags ever could. Doctrine integrates both into routine. Contacts are tracked, classified, and answered without hesitation. The fleet responds not as individuals awaiting orders, but as a coordinated body executing expectation. The distinction between ship, squadron, and command begins to blur. Within this structure, pressure remains constant. Pilots rotate through squadrons. Ships rotate through the line. Crews cycle between action and repair. Fatigue is managed not through rest, but through replacement. The system does not rely on endurance from any single component. It relies on continuity across many. Losses, when they occur, are absorbed without collapse. Aircraft are written off and replaced. Damaged ships withdraw and return. Even sunk carriers do not halt operations for long. The system compensates, redistributes, and continues. What would have been decisive earlier in the war becomes survivable now, not because losses are lighter, but because they are expected. Replacement becomes routine. New hulls arrive already informed by the last engagement. Crews train knowing the procedures they will inherit. Aircraft models evolve mid-conflict, introduced without disrupting tempo. Innovation is not disruptive. It is incremental, layered into the existing structure without pause. This pace creates asymmetry. The enemy adapts, but more slowly. Each response addresses what has already changed. Countermeasures trail the system they are meant to oppose. By the time a solution is fielded, the conditions that demanded it have shifted again. What emerges is not superiority of any single weapon, but dominance of process. The Essex fleet functions as a living organism, self-correcting, self-sustaining, and increasingly indifferent to disruption. It does not seek decisive moments. It generates them. And as this system advances across the Pacific, one reality becomes unavoidable. A war, once imagined as a series of battles, is now being decided by something far less dramatic and far more final: the ability to apply force without interruption until resistance simply runs out. By June 1944, both navies understand that avoidance is no longer possible. The Philippine Sea becomes the stage for commitment, not maneuver. Forces converge with clarity of intent shaped by years of planning and months of attrition. This will not be a probing action or a limited exchange. It is an attempt to decide momentum, to test whether systems or skill will govern what remains of the Pacific War. Japanese planners enter the battle carrying a familiar belief. Their remaining carrier force is smaller, their air groups thinner, but confidence endures in pilot quality. Experience, discipline, and courage are expected to compensate for numerical inferiority. The decisive battle doctrine still holds influence. One moment, properly executed, might still reverse the trend. It is a calculation rooted in tradition, not ignorance. Across the water, the American approach is fundamentally different. Carriers are not arranged in exposed lines or concentrated formations. They deploy in-depth layered task groups spread across wide distances, overlapping in coverage and support. This dispersion is intentional. It dilutes vulnerability while preserving striking power. The fleet is not gathered for spectacle, but for endurance. The first indication of contact arrives not through sight, but through signal. Radar screens register incoming formations while they are still distant, still assembling. The warning time is measured in minutes that did not exist earlier in the war. Those minutes matter. Fighters are launched not in haste, but in sequence, climbing steadily to altitude with fuel and coordination intact. What follows is not chaos, but procedure. American fighters rise in waves, organized, directed, and numerous. Interceptions occur far from the carriers themselves. Japanese strike aircraft encounter resistance earlier and in greater density than anticipated. The sky fills not with confusion, but with imbalance. Within hours, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Japanese losses mount rapidly. Pilots fight with determination, pressing attacks through defensive fire, but attrition proves merciless. Each aircraft lost represents experience that cannot be replaced. American losses occur as well, but the system absorbs them without pause. Replacement squadrons launch as others land. The rhythm does not break. Reports flow upward through command channels, stripped of emotion. Sortie counts, interception rates, loss ratios. Numbers accumulate faster than narratives. The battle does not hinge on a single dramatic moment or heroic decision. It unfolds as arithmetic, each engagement reinforcing a trend already in motion. By afternoon, the outcome is effectively decided. Japanese air power has been expended in exchange for minimal disruption. The carriers they sought to cripple remain operational, their decks cycling aircraft with mechanical consistency. What was intended as a decisive blow has instead revealed the depth of imbalance. The turning point does not announce itself with spectacle. There is no single explosion to mark it, no flagship lost in flame. It arrives quietly, through confirmation, through data aligning too consistently to ignore. The numbers no longer suggest possibility. They describe inevitability. As the sun lowers over the Philippine Sea, both sides understand that something fundamental has shifted. Not merely a battle lost or won, but a question answered. The age of pilot skill overcoming material disadvantage has ended here, not with disgrace, but with finality. And as reports continue to arrive long after the last aircraft has landed, a deeper realization takes hold. This was not the last such engagement. It was the first in which the outcome could no longer vary. Japanese pilots enter the latter stages of the Pacific War with discipline intact. Their training, once among the most demanding in the world, has instilled precision, restraint, and courage under fire. In the skies above the Philippine Sea and beyond, they fly with professionalism, pressing attacks through overwhelming odds, maintaining formation where possible, and executing orders with clarity even as losses mount. Skill, in these moments, is undeniable, but skill alone cannot negotiate with attrition. Each engagement removes experience that took years to cultivate. Veteran pilots fall, and with them, vanish instincts that cannot be taught quickly: judgment at altitude, timing under pressure, survival in chaos. The arithmetic of loss begins to dominate. Courage does not slow it. Discipline does not reverse it. Replacement pilots arrive with commitment, but without depth. Training programs, compressed by necessity and constrained by resources, cannot replicate what has been lost. Flight hours are fewer. Instructors are scarcer. The margin for error narrows with every sortie. What once was an elite cadre becomes thinner, then brittle, not through failure of will, but through exhaustion of possibility. Across the ocean, the American training pipeline remains full. New pilots arrive steadily, trained within a system designed for continuity rather than brilliance. They are competent, not exceptional, and that is enough. Their preparation aligns with the fleet they will join, standardized in procedure, expectation, and support. Experience is accumulated collectively, not hoarded individually. On deck, the contrast becomes visible. American deck crews recover aircraft at industrial tempo. Landings occur in sequence, aircraft cleared, refueled, rearmed, and returned to the cycle with minimal delay. There is little ceremony in the process. Efficiency replaces urgency. The flight deck becomes a factory floor, optimized for repetition under pressure. This rhythm shapes outcomes. Victory emerges not from singular feats or decisive duels, but from sustained output. Sorties flown, interceptions completed, losses replaced. Each day, the system produces results with mechanical reliability. Individual heroism still exists, but it no longer determines direction. It is absorbed into process. The horizon reflects this shift. Where once fleets thinned with every engagement, now they remain crowded. Carriers hold station. Aircraft fill the sky. Presence does not diminish with effort, it persists. The enemy confronts not a force that can be exhausted, but one that grows more efficient with use. In this environment, the meaning of skill changes. It no longer defines victory. It defines survival within a system that favors scale. And as engagements continue, the question facing those who still fly is no longer whether they can outfight their opponent, but whether fighting, under these conditions, can still change anything at all. Japanese fleet doctrine does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes. Each engagement strips away another assumption, another expectation that once gave coherence to planning. The belief in decisive battle, in concentration of elite force at the critical moment, survives longer in language than in practice. At sea, operational reality proves less forgiving than theory. Battleships remain largely intact, yet increasingly irrelevant. Their guns, designed for engagements that never arrive, face an enemy that refuses proximity. They steam, maneuver, and wait symbols of a strategic era already passing. Power exists, but without opportunity. The center of naval warfare has shifted beyond their reach. Commanders see the imbalance clearly. Reports are read without illusion. Losses cannot be replaced at pace. Training pipelines have thinned beyond recovery. Fuel shortages restrict movement. Air cover weakens. The numbers no longer support ambition. What once might have been countered through skill or timing now resists every adjustment. Strategic options narrow accordingly. The objective becomes delay rather than victory. Operations are planned to slow advance, to raise cost, to extend the timeline in hope of political or material change. The language of decision gives way to the language of endurance. Survival replaces initiative. Meanwhile, the Essex fleet advances methodically. Islands fall not through dramatic confrontation, but through sustained pressure. Carriers reposition, rearm, and return. The pace does not fluctuate. There are no pauses to celebrate success or mourn loss. The system moves forward because it is designed to do so. War, at this stage, becomes arithmetic. Sorties flown versus sorties opposed. Hulls launched versus hulls lost. Fuel delivered versus fuel consumed. The margins are measured and recalculated daily. Emotion recedes. What remains is clarity, uncomfortable, undeniable. The climax arrives without spectacle. There is no final battle to redeem doctrine or restore balance. Instead, certainty settles across command tables and chart rooms. The outcome is no longer debated. It is accounted for. In this quiet resolution, the true defeat becomes visible. Not the loss of ships or territory, but the recognition that the war has moved beyond the ideas that once governed it. And as the Essex carriers continue their advance, the question no longer concerns whether the conflict can be reversed, but how long the inevitable can be postponed. By the final year of the war, the Essex carriers are no longer a novelty or even a subject of analysis. They are the backbone of every major American operation in the Pacific. Wherever pressure is applied against island chains, shipping lanes, or remaining fleet elements, their presence is assumed. Planning begins not with the question of whether carriers will be available, but with how many can be committed without slowing the next advance. Losses continue, but their meaning is changed. Ships are damaged, aircraft destroyed, crews killed. None of this is abstract. Yet momentum does not falter. A carrier withdrawn for repair is replaced by another already en route. Air groups are replenished from reserves planned months earlier. The system absorbs shock without pause, redistributing weight across its structure with mechanical indifference. What becomes increasingly striking is that production does not slow as victory approaches. New Essex hulls slide into the water even as earlier ships return from combat worn and scarred. There is no dramatic recalibration, no signal to ease effort. The industrial process continues because it was designed to continue, independent of morale or optimism. War production does not wait for certainty. It creates it. Across the Pacific, Japan cannot respond in kind. Shipbuilding capacity has been eroded by bombing, resource shortages, and attrition of skilled labor. Designs exist on paper, but materials do not arrive. Timelines stretch beyond relevance. Each new American carrier entering service widens a gap that can no longer be narrowed. The imbalance is not temporary. It compounds. At this stage, speeches lose relevance. Declarations of resolve cannot obscure arithmetic. Numbers describe reality more clearly than ideology ever could. Carriers, operational. Sorties flown. Replacement intervals. These figures circulate through command channels with quiet authority. They do not inspire, but they decide. Control of the sea becomes something closer to permanence than advantage. American carriers dictate where combat will occur and where it will not. Enemy movement is constrained before it begins. Supply routes collapse under observation alone. The ocean ceases to be a contested space and becomes a managed one. The presence of the Essex fleet reshapes time itself. Operations are no longer sequenced cautiously around recovery and refit. Pressure is sustained week after week, month after month. The enemy has no opportunity to rebuild, only to respond. Initiative no longer changes hands. It disappears as a concept. In retrospect, the scale becomes almost difficult to grasp. Not because it was hidden, but because it was so methodical. There are no singular moments to commemorate, no single launch, no single battle that explains the outcome. Instead, there is accumulation, hull after hull, deck after deck, presence replacing uncertainty. The laughter of earlier years is no longer remembered, not because it was insignificant, but because it has been erased by consequence. Assumptions that once felt reasonable are buried beneath steel and statistics. What remains is outcome measurable, undeniable, and final. By the time the war nears its end, counting the carriers becomes an exercise without urgency. There are always enough, more than enough. And in that quiet surplus lies the true consequence of industrial war. Not triumph, not vindication, but control, so complete that resistance fades, not with a final blow, but with exhaustion. The Pacific settles into a new order, shaped not by a single decision, but by years of repetition. And as the Essex carriers continue to patrol waters no longer contested, the story they tell is no longer about how the war was fought, but about why its ending could never have been otherwise. The Essex program does not merely win a war, it changes the grammar of naval power. When the conflict ends, no serious navy can return to the assumptions that preceded it. Sea power is no longer defined by singular platforms or decisive moments, but by the ability to sustain pressure indefinitely. What matters most is not how brilliantly a fleet can fight once, but how reliably it can keep fighting. Strategy adjusts accordingly. The idea of the decisive battle, long central to naval thinking, loses its authority. Victory no longer hinges on a single engagement that resolves everything at once. Instead, dominance is accumulated gradually, enforced through presence, repetition, and denial of recovery. Control becomes something maintained rather than seized. The Essex carriers demonstrate that wars at sea can be decided without climactic confrontation. In this new framework, technology cannot be separated from logistics. A carrier's power does not end at the edge of its flight deck. It extends backward through supply chains, training pipelines, fuel convoys, and repair facilities. Radar, aircraft, and weapons are only as effective as the systems that sustain them. Innovation matters, but only when it can be reproduced, supported, and replaced at scale. Courage remains essential within this structure. Pilots still fly into danger. Crews still fight fires and flooding. Decisions still carry human consequence. But courage alone is no longer decisive. It operates inside a system that either amplifies or exhausts it. Where the system is strong, courage endures. Where it is weak, courage is consumed without effect. The human cost of this transformation is not erased by its efficiency. It is embedded within it. Steel hulls carry scars invisible to charts, patched compartments, reinforced bulkheads, names engraved quietly into memory. Every improvement in survivability reflects earlier losses. Every procedural refinement traces back to moments when something failed and people paid the price. Victory, when it arrives, does so without triumphalism. There is no single moment to celebrate, no final blow that feels cathartic. The war ends because resistance can no longer be sustained, not because it has been dramatically destroyed. The system has simply outlasted its opponent. What remains is relief, tempered by awareness of cost. In the aftermath, reflection replaces celebration. Naval planners study production schedules as carefully as battle reports. Historians trace outcomes not only to commanders and tactics, but to factories, training commands, and dockyards. The Essex carriers are remembered not as heroic exceptions, but as proof of a principle, that modern war rewards preparation more than inspiration. This realization carries an unease. Industrial war is effective, but impersonal. It reduces conflict to flows of material and time, where outcomes are determined long before forces meet. Responsibility disperses across thousands of decisions made far from the front. Moral weight does not disappear, but it becomes harder to locate. The legacy of the Essex program endures beyond the Pacific. Future navies absorb its lesson, even when they resist its implications. They build systems designed to endure, to rotate, to replace. They plan for wars that may never culminate in a single defining battle. In understanding what industrial war means, the final clarity is sobering. Power is no longer dramatic. It is patient. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives prepared, stays organized, and leaves little room for surprise. And when such power prevails, the question that lingers is not how brilliantly victory was achieved, but how quietly it became inevitable. The Pacific War does not end with the sinking of a final ship or the silence of a last gun. It ends with a system still intact. Carriers remain on station. Supply lines remain open. Aircraft continue to launch and recover with practiced regularity. The machinery of war does not collapse at the moment of victory. It simply no longer faces resistance capable of challenging it. What concludes the conflict is not destruction, but endurance. This distinction matters. Throughout history, wars at sea were remembered through singular moments, flagships burning, fleets shattered in a single afternoon. The Pacific concludes differently. The outcome is the cumulative result of years of repetition, refinement, and replacement. The Essex carriers are present not as survivors of chance, but as evidence of a method that worked exactly as intended. In the years that follow, navies around the world study this outcome with care. The lesson is not limited to carrier aviation or American industry. It speaks to something broader and less comfortable. Power, it reveals, no longer depends on brilliance alone. It depends on systems designed to function under stress, to learn without pause, and to endure without exhaustion. The future belongs to those who can build such systems before they are needed. Assumptions, in this context, emerge as the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Japan did not lose because it lacked courage or intelligence. It lost because its expectations of war hardened too early. It believed limits existed where none did. It trusted that quality would always outrun quantity, and that decisive moments would still determine fate. Those beliefs were reasonable until they were not. War punishes certainty more reliably than it punishes weakness. Once assumptions harden into doctrine, they resist correction even as evidence accumulates. The Essex carriers did not merely challenge Japanese naval power. They invalidated the framework through which that power understood the conflict. By the time correction became unavoidable, time itself had become the enemy. Laughter fades fastest in war. The dismissals of earlier years leave no trace in official records. They survive only as absence gaps between expectation and outcome. No one remembers precisely when confidence turned to concern or when certainty gave way to calculation. What remains is result, stripped of emotion and explanation. The horizon, however, remembers. It remembers the moment when steel decks filled its width without warning, when silhouettes multiplied beyond counting, when the sea ceased to offer concealment or distance. That image of carriers, aligned, operational, and unhurried marks the true end of one era and the beginning of another. 17 carriers once occupied that space together, not as spectacle, but as statement. They did not announce themselves. They did not require explanation. Their presence answered every remaining question about the war's direction. From that moment forward, outcomes varied only in timing, not in nature. The Essex carriers were not invincible. They burned, flooded, and broke apart, like all ships in war. But they belonged to a system that treated loss as information rather than catastrophe. Each failure sharpened the next iteration. Each sacrifice informed a correction. In that cycle, defeat found no place to settle. What the Pacific War ultimately demonstrates is not the triumph of technology over humanity, but the consequence of scale applied with discipline. Human courage remained essential, but it operated inside structures that multiplied its effect. Where those structures existed, effort accumulated. Where they did not, effort vanished into the sea. The moral weight of this transformation lingers. Industrial war does not celebrate its victories loudly. It produces outcomes that feel inevitable in hindsight and unsettling in reflection. Responsibility disperses across factories, offices, and planning tables far from the sound of combat. The line between decision and consequence stretches until it is difficult to see where one ends and the other begins. Yet the lesson remains unavoidable. Wars are no longer decided solely by what happens at the front. They are decided by what is built, learned, and repeated long before the first shot is fired. The horizon reveals only the final result of choices made years earlier, often without urgency or applause. In remembering the Essex carriers, it is tempting to focus on their numbers or their battles, but their true significance lies elsewhere. They represent the moment when warfare crossed a threshold from contests of courage and command into contests of continuity and preparation. They laughed at it once, at the idea that such numbers could exist, at the belief that industry could outpace tradition, at the assumption that war would remain bound by familiar limits. The horizon answered those doubts without words, and when the laughter faded, it did not return.